Have you ever heard the phrase, behind every joke is a kernel of truth? Well, critic and journalist Jeff Cohen just came out with a new op-ed arguing that these jokesters may be the only ones telling the truth. He writes, it says something about mainstream TV that the toughest, most consistent questioners of militarism and defending of civil liberties are not the news channels, but they're the comedy channel. And are we back in the days of Shakespeare when the only people who would dare speak the truth to the king were the jesters? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Jeff Cohen, the man himself, journalism professor at Ithaca College. Jeff, why are we seeing this trend of comedians calling it like it is? Why are they the only ones doing this?
Well, I think there's a certain amount of intimidation. I worked at MSNBC, I was at Fox, I was at CNN. At the news channels, they take their leads from the elites of the political parties. MSNBC leans to the Democrats, Fox obviously leans to the Republicans. And when the leaders of the two major parties aren't debating something, and they usually don't debate foreign intervention, both party elites agree on expanding drone strikes. They both agreed on expanding the war in Afghanistan. The leaders of both parties agreed on the invasion of Iraq. So there's not a lot of debate in mainstream news. If you're in news and you question that bipartisan consensus, well, you're seen as biased. That's why the comedians flow in. They have to fill that giant gap.
I see, Jeff. Well, we want to play you something now. Take a listen.
We already spend more on defense than the next 12 countries combined, including China, including Russia. We're like the lady on Jerry Springer who can't stop getting breast implants.
If we're not punishing people who approved of this torture, we can't really punish any Americans because we all basically approved the torture when we re-elected President Bush. Now, sure, it was secret, but we had some hints.
This might be a good time to remind Democrats the president has a drone program with ambiguous constraints and murky legal justifications.
So, Jeff, is this a throwback to those times where the gesture's the only one telling the king the truth, in your opinion?
Unfortunately, that's what it seems to be. I believe that, news is so much sort of tailing after what the government says, what the rulers say, what the people in power say. And these comedians, and Jon Stewart, and especially Colbert, he's a comic genius, they're not playing by the same rules.
I see.
And it's because it's comedy, they can get away with things. Phil Donahue tried to question war and stand up for civil liberties, and MSNBC terminated him 3 weeks before the invasion of Iraq, because the Stewarts and the Colberts are operating within the, comedic format. They get away with so much, and if it weren't for Stewart and Colbert, I don't know who would be questioning these things on television.
Okay, so Jeff, these issues like militarism, they seem to be dodged by mainstream media. Do you think that they're doing it on purpose?
Oh, there's no doubt. There's no doubt that militarism is almost untouchable. It may explain why other countries in Northern Europe have universal health care and free college education and we don't. And it explains why, Social Security is now on the chopping block. We have a country that spends most of its federal discretionary spending on the military, war preparation. So, this is the huge elephant in the room. And the mainstream TV news hardly touches it. And that's why we end up with Colbert and Stewart filling the gap. It should be the subject of a raging debate. In other countries, they experience the U.S. war on terror as a U.S. war of terror, kidnappings, drone strikes, killing of civilians, night raids. But we don't have that kind of debate. Thank God we have a couple comedians brave enough to talk about it on primetime TV. Okay,
so heading back to that mainstream media and who they're taking their cues from, do you think that the media obeys the presidential administration's cues on specifically framing the issue? They seem to even adopt their vocabulary, and if you think they do, just how are they doing it?
There's no doubt that they adopt their vocabulary, but it's especially the case when the leaders of both the Democrats and the Republicans agree on the big military budgets, agree on the invasion of Iraq. When the leaders of the two parties don't agree, well, then the mainstream media feels free to say, wow, that is an issue. That's why we have debates about gay marriage, we have debates about gun control, we have debates about minimum wage. but we don't usually have debates about U.S. foreign policy, the U.S. war on terror, so-called, and that's in the absence of real debates in real news channels. That's why so many of us turn to The Daily Show and the Colbert Report, because they're going to ridicule. They're going to show that the emperor doesn't have clothes. They're going to stand up for civil liberties. They've shown it year after year after year.
This idea of mainstream media being fair and balanced, they all like to say that they are. How does this play into them not talking about the real issues?
Well, I think you hit on it. They believe you're fair and balanced if you take your cues from the leaders of the two political parties. And if the two political parties are in agreement, as they were on the invasion of Iraq, as they are on, trying to provoke belligerence with Iran, well, any reporter in the mainstream who steps outside of that bipartisan consensus and asks questions, well, you're likely to get fired and terminated as fast as you can say Phil Donahue. I worked with Phil Donahue when we were all fired 3 weeks before the invasion of Iraq because we were asking journalistic questions. So that's the problem. When their idea of fair and balanced in a lot of mainstream news is, well, what is Boehner saying?
Jeff, I have to leave it there. A lot of great information. That was Jeff Cohen, journalism professor at Ithaca College.